Good morning, everyone. My name is Natalia Molina. I am the Interim Research Director here at the Huntington Library. First, some housekeeping. The exits are clearly marked in the middle of the auditorium. The restrooms are in the back of the auditorium, so when you walked in, if you would have walked in straight, there's a doorway on the left past the buffet. Note that. Feel free to enjoy the coffee, teas, and snacks outside. Get up and move around if you need to. We have a screen outside so you don't miss any of this important dialogue. I also wanted to just say how remarkable this has been so far. Just such an engaging conversation. And it's been so amazing that I didn't get to finish some of my intro remarks yesterday because I did want to tell you a little bit more about our collections, partly because I'm learning about the collection since I'm interim. And one of the things, in addition, besides our early editions of Shakespeare's folios and quartos, is that the Huntington also has the world's largest collection of extra illustrated books. And in extra illustrated books are those published texts that have been made into unique copy by a former owner through the permanent edition of prints, autographs, and letters. Kind of like what I used to do as a kid. So now I'm like, oh, people do these with Shakespeare books. We have almost 1,000 of these sets. And I was speaking earlier with Greg Doran from the Royal Shakespeare Company, and he was telling me about he had been looking at the folios that we have, and that he met with our rare books curator, Steve Tabor, who, the curators are like the faculty of the Huntington. People come from all over the world to speak to Steve about rare books. And they were looking at a folio, and he found a signature that hadn't been seen before. And so Steve brought out, in British speak, the torch, and they looked at it, and so they're still investigating it. But it's just such a marvelous example of what we were missing in the pandemic. We have the research, we have the archives, we have the collection, but we need the collaboration, we need the conversation. And that's what these 2 days are about. We're very fortunate to have Professor Ayanna Thompson bringing us together. What I neglected to mention yesterday in my intro of her is that she's also known for the Race Before Race conference, right? This ongoing conference series and professional network community by and for scholars of color working on issues of race and pre-modern lit, history, and culture. The first conference she had, so this was just her saying, you know what, I want to open this conversation. I'm just going to host a conference, and I'll open it up. It'll be free. Maybe 50 people will come. 300 people came. People still talk about it. When people come look at the Shakespeare collections here at the Huntington, they still talk about it. So thank you for creating that space, Ayanna, and thank you for creating this space for us today. We are looking forward to continuing the conversation.
These only.
Yes.
Thank you and welcome. I'm Michael Witmore. I'm the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library, and I am honored to begin our conversations today in day 2. I would like to acknowledge our presence on the ancestral lands of the Gabrielino Tongva and the Kiz Nation people who continue to call this region home. We had a lively discussion yesterday that followed along 2 tracks. The first was the performance of Shakespeare's plays, and the second was the archives and collections that have been supportive and in dialogue with those performances over the last 2 centuries, perhaps. Today, we're looking to put those 2 streams together in a dialogue, and I cannot imagine a better positioned panel today for that conversation. I want to welcome our panelists and note that I'm sitting on stage here with 3 transformative artists and thinkers, each in their own way. We'll do a conversation that lasts about 2 hours. It'll be 90 minutes of, I hope, some back and forth, and we'll go into places where it feels like there's depth and room to run. We will then open up for 30 minutes of questions from the audience. So let me now introduce our panel. I'll begin with Greg Doran on my far right. Greg became the Artistic Director Emeritus of the Royal Shakespeare Company, having assumed that role in 2012 and served through 2022. Throughout his career, he's worked deeply through the full range of Shakespeare's plays contained in the First Folio, as well as many others, and is responsible for some of the most powerful productions of the plays in the last 2 decades, including a Hamlet that was broadcast on the BBC on Boxing Day. In addition to continuing to direct, he is currently embarked on a survey of the First Folio in numerous locations around the globe. We look forward to welcoming him to the Folger, where we have a few of those. His 2018 production of Troilus and Cressida was the RSC's first equally gender-balanced cast in a Shakespeare play on the main stage and featured the first disabled actor to play a leading Shakespeare role for the company. To my far right, after Greg, Nataki Garrett is a nationally recognized director and the 6th artistic director of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, the first woman to artistically lead a $44 million theater company and the OSF's first black female in that role. Since her appointment in April of 2019, she has guided the organization through the COVID-19 pandemic, tragic local fires, and she has galvanized a cohort of Oregon arts leaders and in securing $8 million for the state's performing arts organizations from the Federal Relief Fund package. She has produced a number of Shakespeare's plays, including a 2-part Henry VI with an all-female trans and non-binary cast, Romeo and Juliet, Midsummer Night's Dream, The Tempest, King John, and many, many others. Next year, Nataki Garrett will direct Shakespeare for the first time, Romeo and Juliet at the OSF. And as you know from the introduction yesterday, to my immediate right, Ayanna Thompson is Regents Professor at the Arizona State University. She is director of their Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. She's past president of the Shakespeare Association of America and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. As a scholar and a dramaturg, she is one of the most sought-after thinkers on Shakespeare and race and a powerful theorist of Shakespeare in performance, both of which fields have now become major academic areas of inquiry. I'm honored and delighted to be here with all of you. Our first question, please. So we had a brief chat before the panel started, and we talked perhaps about maybe your origin story with Shakespeare. We heard some yesterday. It could be fictional, it could be biographical. I think in some cases we've created fictions about that already. But please, why don't we start with you, Ayanna, if you would tell us your first encounter with Shakespeare and where it led you.
Yeah, so I grew up working class poor. We did not go to theater, but my mother was a Shakespeare lover, still is. And so when I was 13, she came into a bit of money unexpectedly, and she was like, we're going to London and Paris. And I was so excited because I was like a punk rock teenager, and all I wanted to do was hang out, with punk rock kids in London. And then she said, oh, and we're going to Stratford-upon-Avon. And I was like, why? That's not London. And she goes, and we're going to see a Shakespeare show. And I was like, why? No, why? But it turns out it was this amazing production of Romeo and Juliet with Sean Bean as Romeo and Hugh Quarshie, the amazing Black British actor, as Tybalt. And it was sexy. They were in leather and riding motorcycles. And I was like, this is amazing. But, that was it for me with Shakespeare. But I think looking back now, my interest in race and performance, and particularly the way that Shakespeare has figured in the history of inclusive casting, that production was incredibly formative for me because I saw someone that looked like me on stage killing it, like just Hugh is such a titan. So I think it really was an important moment in my life, even though at the moment I just thought it was sexy and cool, and I had a poster for 10 years in my bedroom from that production, but I just thought it was sexy. But then now I'm realizing actually it opened a vista for me that I started asking questions about, well, how does this work, and when did it start, and why did it start, and is this the way we want it to be? And it turns out other people weren't asking those questions, probably because they hadn't seen that production at that age, thinking about can I imagine myself in this world? So that's my origin story. So RSC all the way.
I too, my origin story is also connected to Romeo and Juliet. I was 12 or 13 years old in the 7th grade. I don't know what age you are anymore in the 7th grade. And I had an English teacher who introduced me to my first dramatic literature, which was Romeo and Juliet, and introduced it in a way that allowed us to access the poetry first. And then we performed from the play, and then we watched the Zeffirelli movie version, which still is imprinted in my brain because of the noises the boys made in some bedroom scene. I think that sort of marked me in a way. First of all, my connection to Shakespeare was through the music of the language. And my understanding of Shakespeare was intrinsic. Because she didn't offer the intellectual first. We didn't analyze the text and then break it down and understand what happened in this scene and what does this word mean. We didn't do that stuff. So she was like, listen to the sound of these things. And I was like, whoa, because I was 12 or 13. I also remember feeling quite like I wasn't in the play, except for I was the same age as the kids in the play. And so my point of entry was these kids were going against their parents, and they were doing the things that they wanted to do, and they suffered for it. And then I think about 3 years later, I saw my first production of Romeo and Juliet at Berkeley Shakespeare. Now it's called Cal Shakes, and it was directed by Jonathan Moscone, and it was like a outsider's version of Shakespeare, of Romeo and Juliet, where you had the townies and then you had the leather jacket kids or whatever. And I remember that one was also trying to make sure, I feel like the production was trying to make sure I had a connection to it. Mm-hmm. The point of connection that I kept missing was I couldn't figure out why all these really wealthy white people were so upset, I just remember thinking but they have money, so what is because I also grew up, what I like to call working class educated. We had a lot of education, but no money at all. And so I kept, the point of happiness or joy seemed to be connected to money, and I just could not figure out why the parents were always screaming. They were rich. They had a nursemaid, and servants, and I just didn't get it. I still to this day never understood why so many rich white people were so upset.
Okay. It's actually interesting because it's sort of the same age. It's around about 12, 13, I guess. And I attended a Jesuit college, Catholic college, in Preston in the north of England, in Lancashire. My twin sister, who's sitting at the back of the hall, Ruthie, was at the convent school right across the road. We did a Shakespeare play every year, but we never invited the girls to come across the road. So the boys got to play the girls' parts. And in 2A, I missed out on Ophelia to Gags Ronson. Maybe he rot in hell. But in the third form, I got to play Lady Anne, opposite the most beautiful man in the world. He was a sixth former called Rory Edwards. He was glittery and sexy, and he looked. I looked and was occasionally mistaken for Donny Osmond. So he looked like Mark Bolan, T-Rex, I mean, just sex. And I remember having to, the Lady Anne scene, the wooing scene, to finally be kissed by Rory Edwards, and finding it completely overwhelming. And then I had to spit at him, which was even weirder. And I remember, this is me so I'm in my little black lace-ups and, my school tie and my blazer, and the guys down, there are 900 boys in the school playing football down in this wet schoolyard outside, and this magic is happening as the lines get faster and faster and our breathing gets faster and faster, and we build up to this extraordinary kiss, which was on the hand, but and apparently at the moment he kissed me, I heard from the back of the hall Mr. Malone, who was our excellent teacher, shout, "Doran, don't do that." Because I was clearly rolling my eyes or fainting or something. The serious point was, a couple of years later, I did play male parts as well, just to get that clear, but I played Lady Macbeth. And I used to go walking our cairn terrier, Ben, down by the stream where we lived, and it opened out into the salt marshes of the Ribble estuary, and there were some low trees before you got to the marshes, and I would practice the lines, and I just found having those lines in my mouth just extraordinary and empowering. So here's Lady Macbeth saying, "Unsex me here, and fill me from the crown to the toe top full of direst cruelty," and I kind of went. I remember. I was the only gay in the village. From my point of view, there was nobody else that was gay at my school. And it was sort of as if I could take on this other personality and be transformed and articulate with that language. And I found that really empowering. And I think that's lived with me through life, is the sense that Shakespeare was. What I couldn't believe about Shakespeare was that he wasn't just talking to the world. He was talking to me personally about my experience, as a school kid in Preston in the northwest of England. And I found that incredibly empowering. When I recently did the Richard III that Michael kindly referred to with Arthur Hughes, the first disabled actor to play Richard, we got to the press night, and press nights are awful. I mean, awful. Because it's the night you'll get judged, it's the night you sort of lose your virginity, you thought the show was great, but then tomorrow they're going to tell you it was rubbish. And so we all get together, and we pull together and talk about, what we've done and what we think we've done. And it gets a bit tense as people are kind of also thinking about too many other things, like, did I leave the tickets for my family, or did I iron the dress I want to wear tonight? All those things. So we pull together and do some focusing. And then to lighten the mood, I showed Rosie Sheehy, who was playing Lady Anne, the photo of me playing the part 50 years ago. And she said, "It raised the bar very high." So that's my origin story.
Oh, well, so many origin stories, they have the kind of form of sometimes a conversion narrative, sometimes it's a revelation. I was interested in Nataki, in your story. It wasn't so much a play speaking directly to you, well as that, but you noticed everyone around you.
I did, yeah.
And so I wondered if we could talk a little bit about what you knew and didn't know, because sometimes the seeds of a career start early and you can maybe make some of those connections. But in those moments, what was it that you didn't know about what Shakespeare would become in your life and career? Is it possible for you to say a little bit about not only the kind of clarity that you had, but maybe also the blind spots that now you look back on and think, I didn't really understand that?
Yeah, because I wasn't introduced to Shakespeare as if it didn't belong to me. I just didn't think about it. It's sort of like, I was also raised Christian, so like Jesus was always there in some way. Like I just, there are some parts of my whole origin story that I just sort of fell into. Like I was raised by leaders and organizers, and so if you had asked me at any point, if you had asked me yesterday, If I wanted to be a leader, I would have said no. And I still will say that's not what I'm here for. I think that the connection to the work, though, was, it was like I was in grad school when I realized that Shakespeare wasn't for me. You know, that there were a group of people, there was a group of people out in the world who said, you know, that this was actually for them. More recently, I received several letters, like 20 a week for a year, that said that Shakespeare was for white people, and because I wasn't producing it in 2021 during a pandemic, that it meant that I didn't like white people. And there were several. It was like not just one person. It was like several people wrote the same letter to say the same exact thing. And so it's actually in my adulthood that I have this sort of distance, you know, from Shakespeare. And I think the other thing that I didn't know is, until I really was so clear, was that I was in grad school when it occurred to me that nobody would ever hire me to direct a classical text of any sort. And I was clear about it, you know. When I made the decision to direct The Duchess of Malfi in my final year as my thesis project, I made that decision because I was like, I need to find, like, what is the most obscure, never produced, you know, but like funky fun and like, you know, full of evil and good character play that I can direct while I'm in grad school, because if I don't do this now, I will never, ever have the opportunity to do it. And so next year I'm hiring myself to direct my first Shakespeare. And these are things I didn't know, you know, that I would never have access until I was so clear that, you know, people look at me and they go, why are you even interested in that? Right. And I'm like, oh, well, you like hip hop too, right? So why are you even interested in that? You know, where are these lines that we've drawn? So I feel lucky. I was listening to people's origin story yesterday, and I feel lucky that I was not introduced to Shakespeare as if it didn't belong to me. That teacher handed that material to me and treated me like, you can draw, you can make paintings, you can draw, you can write poetry, you can choreograph a dance to how this makes you feel, you can speak this text, you have a connection to it. And so I've just never felt like I was outside of the material. I've always felt an intrinsic connection to what was happening in those plays.
Yeah. So the white waves of guardianship and gatekeeping, that it just didn't crystallize until later, and then waves and waves of it as you've experienced it.
It was
now.
like absolutely. I mean, people have made it, especially in this role that I'm in, this job that I have right now. People are very clear that I have no business being at the helm of this theater, and they are absolutely clear that it's because I'm Black and a woman. And so it's like every day I wake up and I'm staging a revolution, you know?
Right. You may not have arrived thinking you were.
Yeah, I just brush my teeth and all of a sudden there's a coup, you know?
That's very funny. Yeah, donors can be very direct. Ayanna.
I think I have a slightly different take that when I was in college, I studied with Edward Said, and my whole relationship with literature was as a post-colonialist and thinking about race, structures of power, imperialism and its legacies. And I was at Columbia during the Culture Wars. We had a Shakespeare requirement. I was certain the Shakespeare requirement would be ended before I graduated. So I did not take the Shakespeare class until my senior year. It was still a requirement. But I had done all this African-American literature, all this post-colonial literature. I was steeped in, what we now call critical race theory. And so I take this year-long Shakespeare class, and with a very esteemed Shakespearean who recently passed away. And I read Titus Andronicus. He wanted us to read all the plays in chronological order, which is madness as a pedagogical tool, but great for me personally because I started with Titus Andronicus. And everything that I had been studying in these other classes, the tools that they taught me in those other classes, I could bring to bear on this text. There's a biracial baby, there's interracial relationship, there's slavery, there's everything is there. And the professor came in and I'm like, I'm ready to go, Titus Andronicus. And he says, right, we're not going to talk about Titus Andronicus, a silly bit of juvenilia. And I, in that moment...
The rebel was born.
Well, yeah, but in that moment, I understood that I had expertise that he did not have.
Yeah.
I didn't feel disempowered. I felt like, oh, wow, you really don't get it. Like, and actually, I know this better than you do. So it was a kind of a great moment in bad pedagogy.
Well, I share your enthusiasm for Titus. Let me come back to that bit in a second. I guess my experience of doing the plays at school, and I mean, we did them in class, but I kind of was reading them to go, which part can I play? And it was like Frank McCourt in Angela's Ashes says, he was in hospital, he had, I think, TB, so he was confined to a hospital bed for much of his childhood, I think, teenage. And he said, reading Shakespeare was like having jewels in my mouth. And I think that's how I felt, you know, that there was something that this was giving me that I didn't care about exam questions or anything else. I was just getting this extraordinary experience, this kind of visceral experience of joy, of doing these plays. Just on the Titus thing, that was a big point in my life, because my partner, Anthony Scher, and I Tony, being a South African, at the ending of apartheid, we got the opportunity to perform for the first time as a professional in his own country. We performed Titus at the Market Theatre in Johannesburg, and it was an amazing experience because the great thing about doing Titus is that most people will not know the play, so it's like you're not doing Romeo and Juliet and everybody's going, oh, come on, die. It was a very special experience, and partly because we were honoring the violence in the play rather than sort of sending it up or thinking it's some kind of great grand guignol, because we were in a country that had, after all, institutionalized a violent regime for 40 years. And it was... I remember the first, you do a play in England and people have come in with their research, or you ask them what their experience of violence is, and maybe one of them knows somebody who was mugged. It's rare to find any real genuine experience of violence in the nature of the violence in Titus Andronicus. But the woman who is playing Lavinia, who in the play is raped, has her hands cut off and her tongue cut out, had gone to experience and researched all three of those elements, including having your hands chopped off and what you do. So the level of violence that the country was experiencing at the end of apartheid and had experienced fed into that play, and it became a play about... Well, at a time where reconciliation was the real craving of everybody in the country, when Marcus Andronicus at the end of that play says, let us teach us to bind this scattered corn into one mutual sheaf. That sounded like a sort of anthem for the new Rainbow Nation. So it felt, and this is partly Tony's own, Tony had an amazing way of cutting through the crap and just going, this play is not about, 4 centuries of doing these plays. It's about who we are now in this moment, and therefore we just have to respond to the plays in those ways. And I think that is what keeps me going back to the plays and looking at them afresh each time, because we have to reinvent. We have to see who we are now. It's that phrase we often use, don't we? That in Hamlet, Shakespeare says, the purpose of playing is to hold us toward the mirror up to nature. And if you look in that mirror and you don't see your own reflection, then why are you going to engage with that as a art form? And we've tried, just in terms of the experience I had as a teenager of getting kids engaged with Shakespeare, I think that's been the platform for 20 years now at the RSC of getting kids to do it on their feet, say it out loud, and not spend all the time all that conversation, lovely conversation yesterday about footnotes, with the young man down here saying footnotes. Well, footnotes, the Arden footnotes are the most dense, but somebody once said, trying to read a play and keep on having to look at the footnotes is like the doorbell ringing on the first night of your honeymoon and having to go down and answer the door. And it's you're really in the mood, and then you go, oh right, okay.
So I want to stop you there because this will maybe advance the conversation we started yesterday. So in each story, I think you've got a really interesting collision of maybe a teacher, whether it's a parent or someone who's interested in opening some doors, let's say. But then there's personal experience. You see a play and you recognize, I see myself in it, but I also realize that I'm different from other people and I have a partial view of things. So that's a very powerful experience. Then you think about the decades, maybe centuries of scholars who've been working to provide this scaffolding for interpreting the plays, to know what the words mean. And one thing you could say is we know enough facts about Shakespeare. There are actually only 9 or 10 anyway. And we've had a good go at the words, and we think we kind of know what they mean. So what's left is personal experience and this moment of actual encounter. And if that's the case, I think we should just put it on the table. Why should we have archives for Shakespeare? And what's the role of the people who aren't necessarily saying what the words mean and, bringing all the biblical hermeneutics that have been applied, but more people, and I think of this more as the humanities rather than librarianship, although they're related. Someone who said, I want to create a moment where who you are meets a tradition where people have over and over again tried to see themselves or not see. There's misfires too. Do we really need more facts?
Well, acting is hard. And I think different actors go through their process in different ways. Some people need no facts. And some people, their process requires a lot of facts. And so I think to be, either a dramaturg or a scholar in the rehearsal room, you have to respect the actors and what they need and what fuels them, because it would be a mistake just to give them all the facts, because some people that literally shuts them down. So I think one of the tensions between scholars working in theaters and with practitioners is that we often think with the facts you'll get to the truth and that will open up the gates for your performance. And in fact, sometimes it's just sitting quietly and saying, the emotional, whatever weird emotional thing you're bringing to this, that's actually opening it up perfectly. And where scholars are not trained to be flexible in that way. And I will say, there is so much need right now for scholars of color in particular to be in the Shakespeare theater space. I turn down lots of work because I just can't do it all. And so I'm constantly talking to early career people being like, there's a lot of work for you. There may not be a lot of academic jobs, but there's a lot of theater work. Theater's precarious right now, so it might shut down, but there is still a hunger in those rooms, so.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you. I feel like I think you need all of it. I think you need people who think about it. I think you need people who feel about it. I think you need people who stand up in it and walk around in it. I think you need this sort of collision of possibilities. And I think the excising one thing to sort of create space for another thing isn't going to work. I think the another question that's related is, I don't know very many young people who sort of feel like they've been introduced to Shakespeare in a way that allows them to have access. And so, which is the thing that gives access, I think, is a question. Is it like giving people sort of like a sort of intrinsic belly-based knowledge of what do you feel when you say these words? Is it a clarification of what this word used to mean and what it means now? Is it a potential translation that sort of gives it to you in modern language? And I think yes is the answer. Mm-hmm. Is that the way that you continue generations from now to use the work of Shakespeare to continue to inspire more writing, to inspire more acting, to inspire more being human and humane. The way that you do it is, yes, you use all of the avenues, and you count them all as necessary and important, and you don't pit them up against one another. You say all of it is necessary, and when you encounter people, in particular young people, who don't feel like this is for them, you don't cram it down their throat and treat them like they're idiots because they don't have a connection to the language. You place it someplace nearby, and you hope that one day they'll come to it, and you know that if they don't, it's okay. There's probably going to be the 50th movie version of Romeo and Juliet. It'll get to them some way. Yeah. And that language still stands if it's on a stage, or if it's in a screen, or if it's on your telephone, on your mobile phone. It still has an impact. The language doesn't care what the carrier is. The language only cares that it meets the ear to get to the heart, to sort of allow you to have a deeper sense of humanity and understanding. So yes, all of it. Let's use all of it.
I agree entirely, and I think there's a distinction that sometimes we might make, but that necessarily actors don't have to make, which is there's an appeal through all the research to the head, but the language insists on being present in the body. And somehow you have to... I'm not going to talk about Lady Macbeth all afternoon, but I remember playing Lady M, and the school, a tour came to the school of a professional company doing it, and they had done it for the school, so they had kind of changed the language. And so Lady Macbeth, when she says, "Let no compunctious visitings of nature shake my fell purpose," the actor said, "Let no horrid visitings of nature shake my fell purpose." And I went, horrid? It's not horrid, it's compunctious. I had no idea what compunctious means, but it's got a k and a p and a sh, and it sounds really violent. And I found myself really kind of appalled by that I was being patronized, actually. But I think actors, you can, the danger is the very words iambic pentameter can put so many actors. They just think, we're Latin, what are they? I don't know what this means. This doesn't seem to be anything to do with my experience. And you can, because intellectually you may think it's really interesting that, the caesura works like this. You've got to be careful that the actor has access to that and can interpret that, and laying out the possibilities of research. I love having academics in my rehearsal room, because they always illuminate something by saying, this was what was happening in those days, and did you know that actually London had thousands of black people in it?
Yes.
Elizabethan London.
And that was hard-won knowledge that came out of archives, and
exactly
incredible
right.
patience to know that fact.
Really, and sort of going through parish registers and discovering, the number of black people there. And I've found that, and just getting to know Ayanna over the last few years, I occasionally go, Ayanna, I think Rosaline in Love's Labour's Lost must have been a black actor. And she went, wow, that's cool. You might be crazy, but let's see. Because the other black characters, their color is critical to their perception in society. It's critical to their role in the play. And then Rosaline has a lot of conversation about, people talk about her being black, Baron's girlfriend. They're some of the most racist language in Shakespeare is how they describe Rosaline. One of them says, she's fair if coal miners are fair. Or she's fair if chimney sweeps are fair. And then one of them says, I tell you what, this is your girlfriend's face and my foot, pointing to his black polished shoe, presumably. And you kind of go, this is appalling racism, but at the same time what Shakespeare seems to be doing is presenting an alternative view, because Barone finds that they are all wrong and that she is beautiful. And I kind of went, are they really going to cast a black actor with a white actor, do all the makeup and all the rest of it for what is only a few lines in the play? She's witty, that's her major factor. And I found the dialogues around that, being able to turn to an academic and say, I have no idea what this means, what does it mean? And having the context filled out is always so valuable.
Mm. And I think just because we sort of referenced but didn't cite specifically Imtiaz Habib's work in those Paris registries to document how many Black people were in Elizabethan and Jacobean England, it does transform the way you think about what a lot of the plays mean if you imagine a diverse audience.
Yeah.
Like it does fundamentally change you. So there's a moment when new evidence from the archives that we forgot for 400 years then makes us reimagine everything about what Shakespeare was creating and for whom. It's an amazing moment. I love this idea that Rosalind might have been a young Black boy actor. I think it's really interesting, especially in light of all of the kind of Black entertainers that were used at court.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem that far out. And the fact that we're just talking about it in 2022 does to me suggest that the intersection of the scholar, the archive, the maker has to continue, right?
Yeah. And there are three great traditions for figuring out how true that is.
Yeah.
One is to perform it, another is to go back and look at the documents, and a third is to talk to people who've studied it, and those are all viable options. I wonder sometimes what would happen if all the knowledge we have about the Elizabethan Jacobean period just disappeared and all we had was this strange object, which is, here's the plays. So in that possible world...
and would we also not have the performance history?
We'd have nothing.
Nothing.
It arrives in a bottle.
Okay.
And so the question is, what do you do as an artist, as a thinker with that? I can guess a couple of things. Having those words in you is extremely powerful. But I suppose that's another way of asking, where would we be if we didn't have those curious people like Imtiaz Habib and others just going into these places and figuring things out?
I have a sense, looking at all Shakespeare's folios, Shakespeare's folio gets published 7 years after his death. In the year he died, Ben Jonson published his folio, which was the first time, effectively, that anybody had thought that plays were worth publishing in a folio version, with proper rag paper and, the same format as the Bible, for God's sake. But we haven't been doing Ben Jonson for 400 years. And occasionally we do them in Stratford, and it's always wonderful when we do, but I remember doing the New Inn by Ben Jonson. I was in it. And there were lines that were full of kind of colour and historical sort of sexiness. That one character said, "Oh, he'll out-swagger all the wapentake." That's a wonderful, he'll out-swagger all the wapentake. Or, they'll be punching puck fists. Now, there are lots of phrases in Shakespeare which are as obscure as that, but because we've been doing him for 400 years, they're not obscure. Do you know what I mean? And one of the things that I have found, for me, one of the most successful interactions at Stratford between scholars and actors and directors, we did something called the Scholar's Pitch. And I realized I've always been a champion of Shakespeare's contemporaries. So people write to me, have done for years, to say, well, you're meant to be the champion. Why haven't we done Hengist, King of Kent yet? Or various very, very obscure Shakespeare. Sigh. And I kind of got four scholars to go, okay, pitch me four plays that you think we could do in the Swan. Plays we may know or we may not know at all, plays that, but I want you to take some responsibility in that. Will actors like these parts? Will they grab them? Will they get them? Will directors want to do them? And more importantly, will audiences want to see them? So 4 scholars came into the Lion's Den. We gave them 6 actors each and a director and a week, and they looked at 4 plays each day. And they were really interesting plays. And then at the end of the week, each group pitched their choice. I have to tell you, Ben Johnson's The Magnetic Lady didn't make it past the first hour. Sorry about that. And then out of that choice, each group pitched by doing scenes from the play. There was one called The Insatiate Countess, which scored very high. But what came about was the actors' enthusiasm, the director's sense that there was real meat here, and the academics understanding that they had spent years thinking this play ought to be done now. And so the winner, we did the following year in the Swan Theatre as part of the season, and it was Ford's Love Sacrifice, if you want to know.
I put in a pitch to one of your scholars and I don't think it was carried forward, but I'm going to put a plug in for Chettle's The Tragedy of Hoffman. Bonkers play. Great revenge tragedy.
Very good.
I'm just sort of grappling with the question a little bit. I'm wondering, again, what is in the absence of something, something else springs up. So you might have a group of people who interpret that material and language and use it for something terrible, which has happened. Yeah. And you might have a group of people who sort of use that language and interpret it and use it for something wonderful, which has also happened. So I think the material all by itself, sort of born into the world without any kind of history, ancestry, or parentage, has the potential to do both good and evil. And so I think you're talking about a group of plays being born into the world without any kind of connection to their lineage, but would the people also be without lineage? Mm-hmm. And so I think you also have to bring that into it. Who have we been? There is a reason why there's such pushback. Barry talked about it yesterday at the Globe. There's pushback at OSF. There's pushback at these theaters for doing these Shakespeare plays or classical texts outside of what has been designed as the normative way of doing it. Yeah. And so there is a design in this country that is connected to the culture of this country that says that this is the only way that this exists in this way, and it's for this group of people only, and do not step outside of the lines and the barriers of that. And that is as if the plays didn't have any parentage. I believe there's a reason why somebody recently discovered, through looking at parish logs, that there were Black people living, in Jacobean and Elizabethan England, because not knowing that is also by design.
It is by design.
And so I think the question is sort of connected to that.
Yes.
What happens when you just sort of erase the history? Perhaps some recent things that happened in our government is what happens. It's like what happens when you reinterpret any kind of text, like the Constitution, as if it didn't have a lineage. Yes. It's what we're living in right now. And so the erasure of the history is also by design.
Yeah.
And that's part of why I think we need scholars, like somebody to hang around and sort of look under the rug and be like, I wonder there's a whole world of discovery under there. Yeah. Who covered it up?
Yeah. And I want to put in a plug. It's available for free on YouTube. My research center did, it's a short event, it's an hour long, called Rights Revoked After the Dobbs Decision. And it was 2 medieval scholars and 2 early modern scholars talking about the history of abortion rights for a long time. So like the history that the Dobbs decision put forward is actually ahistorical. So anyway, if you look up Rights Revoked on YouTube, you'll find this hour-long discussion, and it's unbelievable, again, the history that was completely erased.
Well, sorry, Greg, but scholarship is an antidote to the desire to unknow things. And that's one of the reasons we know it.
Can be.
It can be. It depends on what people study.
Yeah.
And the questions asked. So what is your dream list of things you feel we should be studying? Or, I mean, you could subtract Shakespeare, there'd still be a long conversation about identity, passion, sexuality, class. All of these things would have come up from other writers. But which conversations do you feel would be relevant for the humanists and the scholars in this audience who want to advance them? Because there's a lot at stake.
I can answer that in a slightly different way, but what struck me, actually something that came out of yesterday's discussion, where Davenant's version of Macbeth was performed at the Folger. And I was thinking, Banquo says, doesn't he, to the witches, if we could look into the seeds of if you can look into the seeds of time and see which grains will grow and which will not. Looking back at what happened within 15 to 20 years after Shakespeare's death, the theatres were closed. Division in the country meant that actually it wasn't just culture wars, theatre got closed down. We then had a civil war because of the division in the country. But what came out of that in terms of how we view Shakespeare were three different things, I think. And I think they may have, for Shakespeare, history is a warning and a prophecy, and I think this could be prophetic in how we don't get too tied up in thinking of what was the phrase that Barry used, the suppression of English ideas of how to do Shakespeare, or whatever that was. But it's the fact that at the Restoration they did a version of Davenant and Dryden did a version of The Tempest, and added women to it. So Miranda gets a sister called Dorinda, and Ariel gets a girlfriend, and Caliban gets a sister. Because there were women available to be on the stage, and that they wanted Shakespeare to accommodate that. So they rewrote Shakespeare in order for that to happen. We may do differently, we may regender, we may do all sorts of things. When they did that Macbeth, they added an aerial ballet of witches because the technological advances in theatre were such that there were whole new sets of opportunities. But also in the King Lear, the Nahum Tate happy ending of King Lear happened because they could not tolerate that view of the world that had persisted and was part of Shakespeare's thinking of the Jacobean period. And that happy ending of King Lear, though we tend to sneer about it now, that held the stage for 130 years. And Edmund Kean tried to put on the original ending, put it on for 3 nights, and I was forced to put back the happy ending. And I think what that tells me is that the history of Shakespeare performance is the history of, say, adapting it and making it your
And that's
own.
your answer to this question, I think.
It's
More history of adaptation of performance.
Well, and I was recently in Frankfurt at the book fair. Shakespeare's first folio was first announced at the folio of the book fair in 1622 rather. And I was expecting to, engage with Unser Shakespeare, as the Germans call Shakespeare. They absolutely love Shakespeare. But after that book fair, they didn't buy first folios. The only 3 folios in Germany, 2 of them arrived in 1960, and one of them was a gift from Queen Victoria. And I sort of said, why is that? And a wonderful scholar said to me, well, in Germany, we enjoy Shakespeare in translation, and therefore
In the original German. And we can keep therefore adapting and changing, and we don't get hung up about what does fardel mean.
And I think that it's a completely different view of how we receive, how we interpret, how we adapt, and how we accept Shakespeare. I did a Chinese play. And because one of the things we've been trying to do at Stratford is also to broaden the repertoire, to go it isn't just Shakespeare. So what are the great classics coming out of the ancient Chinese tradition, for instance? We did a play called The Orphan of Zhao, which they call the Chinese Hamlet, or at least they don't. It was referred to as the Chinese Hamlet to give it a hook. But in trying to work back to the origin of I wanted to get back to the original. And I realized it was like peeling an onion. There isn't an original. It happens at some point. No. And then a Chinese scholar said to me, the tradition in China with a play like The Orphan of Zhao is that you change it.
Yes.
That you not just, they've made some changes, they've cut those lines. That's the point. That you adapt the classic for who you are now, who you are working with, and what your audience is. And I found that so refreshing. So we weren't trying to do an ancient Chinese classic as they performed it in ancient China. That would have been gross. But to do it now and to make it appeal to how telling this, we're connected by the stories we tell. And the way we tell those stories can be very invigorating and refreshing to our theatre traditions. And I think that to me, I thought, I wish we could do that with Shakespeare.
Well, we'll put it on the to-do list for 2015.
Thank you. That's it.
For research libraries and humanities, watch performance adaptation and the history of how these plays are. So that's on the list.
Yeah. Yes, but I want to add, because Nataki is here, that it would be great for scholars to keep track about who gets to adapt, who's allowed to make these radical, playful changes, and who isn't. I think it is incumbent upon us to actually keep track of how our society replicates this kind of white supremacist idea that, Greg, you're innovative when you play with Shakespeare. Nataki, you're raping Shakespeare.
Yes, I have violated Shakespeare. I have allowed for the violation of Shakespeare. Interesting. In recent articles, people keep saying that I'm doing I just produced a diverse Tempest. And I keep bristling at that. Yeah, sure. I mean, it's diverse. It's got all kinds of things happening in it. It's diverse, and it's got several different ways of this. The aesthetic is different in all these ways. The people look different from each other. There are men and women and trans and non-binary. There are all kinds of things happening. There's a lot of difference in the space. But the primary thing that people are focused on is that the Duke and Prospero were both black men. Now, I'm not the first one to do that in any theater under the sun in the world, right? So, but the fact that the focus is as if I had some sort of, odd agenda to be like, I'm going to make sure that it's diverse, and that's because I'm black. So it's obvious that I have an agenda. My blackness is political, and it brings an agenda. And that's what I was thinking about this morning when I took a shower, is how political I am. And so, I constantly am, this is constantly chasing me. So what we actually did was we cast from a number of OSF's company who have been a part of OSF for a number of years. So we cast like I like to call them the old heads. I say that lovingly, but the people who had been a part of OSF since before I got there. And the people who decided to audition happened to be the people who, got these roles in the play. And so the act of existing while in a black female body while you're engaging with Shakespeare is this sort of ultimate violation. So I feel like at the heart of the question is who gets to do it, how it gets to be done, who's allowed, what the offering is. And then the other question that I keep asking is, and then for what? Because there are rooms full of kids in their rooms right now looking on their iPads, who really could care less. And because, it's mostly because we have taught generations of people that it's not for them, or they get in this sort of like, I'm one of those kids, in one of those educational programs in a theater where I show up and I have people talk to me for an hour and 15 minutes about how I should behave in the theater first. And then I was like this kid, because my mother and grandmother both took me to the opera and the ballet and the theater, so they were like, don't breathe and don't move and don't think and don't talk and don't. There's a whole list, and I'm sitting there with like my hands under my thighs, like, I'm so good. I couldn't tell you what happened on the stage. And so when I'm in a theater and I'm watching a group of young people, and they just went through the sort of same state educational programming that theaters like mine have offered for a long time, and they were bored. I watched those kids in that engagement, and they were bored to tears. And they were actually saying out loud to each other, because they weren't allowed to have their phones, how bored they were. This is boring. Oh my God, it's boring. And the wonderful person who was doing the work was actually really quite engaging. But the setup is, you need this translation, and then also behave yourself. So you need this translation, and how you behave in this space and how you connect to what I'm telling you is going to be how we gauge whether or not this is for you. Mm-hmm. And so we've already evaluated whether or not people can make the connection. What's so funny about that particular group of young people, that night we're sitting in the Elizabethan and we're watching my diverse cast of The Tempest. And there's a row of young people, high school age people, maybe middle school age, and they're all sitting there with their hands folded, and the teachers are on either end of them, and they keep looking down the aisle, right? And like, behave, right? And then like a row behind them, there's like 6 of them, and they're all on their phones, and they're back here like ba 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 ba, and like ha 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 ba 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 ba, right? None of their phones went off the whole night, right? They were just talking to each other via their phones, right? So afterwards, I went up to one of them and I was like, what were you texting about? They were like, oh my God, this Momo and Ariel got these wings, right? So they were engaging. And I was like, yeah, that's right. The work itself is the thing that makes the impact, right? They don't need to understand it. They just need to experience, right, something, and they need to have that impact. But if we keep serving it as if it was like, you need to do this thing, and this is what you're supposed to have, and if you're going to be a well-rounded grown-up, you need to engage in this way. So we keep doing that to people. Young people right now are going to find their Shakespeare on YouTube. Yeah. Your Shakespeare. Absolutely. On YouTube. Yeah. That's what they're doing. Right? They don't want to go into the theater because, somebody's grandma who's really sweet to their own grandkid has turned around and sneered at them 11 times. Yeah. Right? So the engagement in the theater is tough. Right? The engagement with the material is tough. The engagement when you're in your classroom, it's tough. When you get to the theater and they tell you, like, don't breathe and don't talk and don't phone, and right? So the question for me always will go back to, I don't know who's coming to the theater in 2050 to see anything, much less Shakespeare. I don't know why anybody would come into a theater and I run 3 in rotating repertory. I don't know what is the draw for a young person, and I mean, because in my theater I'm considered to be young. I just turned 51 a few days ago. Right? I don't know what is the draw, thank you, birthday. I don't know what is the draw, because there's this line that's drawn and this decision that's made it's connected to capitalism and consumerism and this design that says only this group of people, only at this time, only with the money that they have, only with these connections that they bring, only in this way. I had a really great, like super great, wonderful patron who's a good friend of mine now. And he said, when I first got to OSF, he said, well, I like it when the kids come. They laugh at the wrong time, but I like it. And I was like, oh, is there like a script that you all have that says when you're supposed to laugh? And he was like, no. And I was like, right, isn't that right? How do you know what is like the right point to laugh and what is supposed to be engaged and how somebody is taking it? I have sat in rooms with rooms full of white people watching black and brown bodies on stage, and at the most treacherous, traumatic time, I hear somebody laugh. Yeah. Right? Why are they laughing? Because that shit is extremely uncomfortable. And it makes you feel terrible, and you don't know what to do with your body, and you're a human, and so you do something stupid like ha ha ha, because that's what you have access to, and you've been doing that since you were a baby, right? So kids laugh at the wrong time. Old white people laugh at the wrong time. Black and brown-bodied people laugh at the wrong time. It's all the right time because it's your emotional expression. It's connected to you. What I want to do is figure out how I can make sure, if I'm going to run a theater, how I can make sure that there are more and more and more and more and more people who want to come inside of that space, because these spaces have been so treacherous.
So I was asked to do a talk back at the Shakespeare Theater Company in DC many years ago, not that many years ago, maybe 8 years ago. And so I took my teenage son to see the Tempest production that they had, free tickets, right? And when we got to the usher, she looked at my son and she looked at me and she said, "You're going to want to read the synopsis so you know what's going on." But that's right. So, I mean, just to give a real anecdote about what it's like not to feel welcome in the space, right? So that's got to be part of the work that scholars can help practitioners with. I mean, maybe they're not Shakespeare scholars.
And institutions.
Yes.
Institutions need to address that.
Yeah. Like what if you want to exist in 2050 with a healthy budget, you have to change your practices now. And there are people who work on this. They may be in African American studies or sociology or communications. They may not be Shakespeare scholars, but they can tell you what to do.
And apparently there are some Shakespeare scholars who can also tell you what to
I may not always be available, but I can tell you who else is doing it.
She has a list.
I remember starting out my career at the Nottingham Playhouse, and in the middle of the UK Rep Theatre, and they used to have a man with a bow tie on the door, as if he was a bouncer, and he was there not to welcome people in, he was there to keep people out. And I kind of I remember the regime changing and the doorman being given his orders, and thinking how crucial that is. Yeah. And actually, one of the things that we have done over the last decade is to do live from Stratford-upon-Avon, which is having the film cameras film the actual recording the actual performance. And to begin with, we were doing those at the same time. So they were broadcast exactly at the same time as they were being performed. So you were walking into the cinema and sitting down at the same time as the audience in Stratford was sitting down. And one of the things that I think really helped in terms of demystifying walking into a theatre was that there was a kind of communal experience. One of the things about films of Shakespeare's comedies is then generally not very good, because at least when you get a live from, the audience are laughing, and that's infectious. But you can also see, because people still have a perception that you have to dress up to go to the theatre, or you have to put a tie on, or whatever that is. And by seeing an audience and kind of going and getting oh, I see, that's what theatre is. On the first recording we did, which was the David Tennant Richard II, I had a tweet from somebody who said, "Loving watching David Tennant as Richard II in my UCI Whiteley's cinema, eating my chicken korma." And I kind of went, well, I'm glad I'm not sitting next to you eating your chicken korma, but that is fantastic.
That's right.
That's how you want your Shakespeare, and you kind of go, oh, I get this. It means you can also, nobody has a problem walking out of a cinema, but walking out of a packed theatre, you kind of go, you just feel intimidated, and you tend not to do it unless you're making a point, which I have done on occasion. But I think that's,
I do it all the time.
That's very funny. Well, I like how the comments, and Nataki, your comment was right along this line, but to back out and say, well, actually, we have bigger problems. Theater may not exist by 2050. We live in a society that is still organized by racist violence. We may not have a democracy. I mean, you got to put all that on the table, and then you back up and say, well, how about Shakespeare? Media forms have come and gone, so when the printing press arrived, this vanishing art where someone says words and they're just gone, got preserved in books, and now people still say the words. It didn't wipe out theater. just as radio didn't do it, video didn't do it. Computer games now have been adapted. So YouTube won't do it either. What do you think? If you could press the sustain pedal and these moments in the theater where someone does something and it's them. I'm not sure we can get that on YouTube, but what is it that we need to just hold and frame?
So I'm not on social media, so generally anything I say about social media is because I have children. But my daughter, Zadie Smith, came to give a talk at my institution, and she's a prickly, fascinating genius, but she took a shine to my daughter. And my daughter was showing her these videos of people recording themselves having an emotional response to something they had read. And Zadie Smith was like, this is amazing. But it did make me think, like, what if we thought about, a young person's honest response as the video that then you put out there, which normalizes that response, right? So I don't know.
Reaction videos.
Yeah,
People do it
yes,
to music too.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think that that is actually the answer, that your daughter is engaging in this impulse to experience somebody express emotion why theater will exist.
Yes.
Right, and so this is also beyond like the buildings, it's beyond the Western theater. There are places where people engage in this storytelling practice that may not be in the institutions that we call theater here in the United States, and also are not commodified in the same exact way that our theaters are commodified. So I think it will exist, and sort of my goal, the only reason why, in the middle of the pandemic, I had a kind of epiphany, because I kept asking, like, why am I in this position right now? I just got there, and then I opened a season, and 6 days later we shut it down and sent everybody home. And it was, treacherous. And every day I was like, I don't know, should I save this thing? I mean, it was already in trouble when I got it. Maybe it should just fall apart. What's the point? And I did a lot of soul searching and connecting to that organization to figure out, I can save it through this time, right? Right, and then I might have an answer. Maybe I'll save it just to get to this point, and then I was like, oh, there's a little bit more down the road. Let me just go down a little bit further. What is the point of that place? My hope is that the things that I'm trying to do at OSF will allow for another generation, 100 years from now, when my grandmother says, the only thing I can promise you is there will be all new people. 100 years from now, somebody takes over the helm of this place.
That's right.
And they use the foundation, and they can continue to do whatever they need those spaces to do for them. And that's fine with me. I think that's actually what we should have been doing 50 years ago, or in the 1950s with Zelda Fitzhandler's beautiful experiment in the American theater. I feel like, so it is this idea that we have a generation that's outside of theater, because they don't even teach full plays in most public schools anymore. Mm-hmm. You learn a soliloquy from Hamlet, or maybe from Romeo and Juliet, and then you interpret that for a test. And then that's it, right? And that's since 1990. Yeah. And so it's no wonder why young people are sort of finding this connection. I'm not saying that your daughter is doing it for that reason, because your daughter actually has access. But I do believe that part of the reason why there are these other ways in which a whole generations of people who are connecting to emotion, like what does Instagram do? What is TikTok actually doing? What is YouTube really doing? It's these spaces where we're experiencing somebody perform or emote or connect or do something, and that's all we need. We're just trying to do that, right? And so I'm trying to open, so we just did I'm dropping it because it's an episodic Cymbeline, so we just dropped our episodic Cymbeline so that people can experience it. I just was like an epiphany. I was like, oh, we read this play, and it was like cliffhanger, cliffhanger, cliffhanger. Maybe it should be something else. The person who actually did the real work on it, Scarlett Kim, turned it into this beautiful collage-based art thing, episodic symboline where we follow the play linearly all the way through. Maybe there's going to be like 25 people who are like, this is great, we love it. Maybe there's going to be a couple of kids in the gaming world who'll be like, oh, I'll make a connection to this and I'll see myself in it. Maybe it'll be something that people will want to connect to in 50 years. I'm just fishing. I'm just trying to see if there's a way to make sure that people have a connection. But I do know that most young people I know get their theater, musical theater, opera, dance, you name it. They're getting it on YouTube.
Yeah.
They don't want to walk into the theater. They don't want to sit next to me in a theater. They don't want to sit next to you in a theater. So they don't go.
Do you know, we were doing some experiments before the pandemic. We had done a production of The Tempest with Intel, with extraordinary technology that could make Ariel fly as an avatar while the actor on stage, in real time, his movements were echoed on this beautiful. It was exquisite.
It was gorgeous.
But thank you, thank you. But it was a very interesting thing. The digital stuff that we have a brilliant department run by Sarah Ellis, who is a genius, and Sarah has brought together. A bit like Ayanna, you have been done these 2 days, is bringing people together to kind of go, oh, I could help with that, or why don't you think of it like this? And that was a brilliant experiment. It nevertheless made me go, as I think the critics also felt, that if the play hadn't worked, the technology wasn't going to improve it. It needed to get to the actors. But we did another experiment with Magic Leap and we did just the speech, the Seven Ages Man speech from As You Like It. And basically, you watch the actor playing, doing the speech, and as he speaks, a tree behind him blossoms into leaves, and then the leaves fall, and then the tree blows away, and then he blows away. So it's a beautiful kind of realization of that speech. The point about it is that it's devised with the right equipment, and that's developing, to be played on your table or your dinner table or on your classroom floor, and you can beam it in, and you can have a performance. You can have your friends round to watch a Shakespeare play on your table. Now, I kind of went, my mind, this is a brave new world like I'd never imagined. That was before the pandemic. After the pandemic, we craved real people doing things in front of us while we were all in a communal experience of watching that and enjoying it together. And I think we have reassessed to some extent what the digital opportunity is. Nevertheless, I think it will grow alongside it, and I think it will be some of the clues to... That was certainly, the way we did The Tempest was a way of inviting young people in who went, hey, there are avatars in this show. I don't know what the show's about, but let's go and watch it. And I think one of the things you said yesterday, Michael, which interested me in terms of the archive, in talking about books, you said, books will always be there. The first folios are still here 400 years later. But that DVDs, as in VHSs, as in cinefilm before that, there isn't the money to kind of keep updating and keep doing. But isn't that a goal? Shouldn't we have that archive? Because one of the things about the archive of theatre performance is, and indeed theatre running, is how people have brought themselves to the challenges of these plays, how actors have interpreted, does Lady Macbeth faint? What did she do? Or how on earth did anybody solve the blinding of Gloucester, or whatever it is in Shakespeare? Or indeed, how did they in the 1950s, decide that the experiment that really needed to happen was what Miss Littlewood was doing, what Joan Littlewood was doing, that Erica did a fantastic show about for the ROC a couple of years ago. What are those theatre pioneers doing? And we need to record what those pioneers did, like we recorded, I hope we recorded Peter Sellers yesterday afternoon, that there are inspirations to be had from those archives.
So now I'm not as, is my mic on? I guess now I'm not as nervous, but I think one of the things you're saying, okay, can you hear me?
Oh, no. Are they all off?
Mine's on.
Okay.
Let's see.
Just share.
Oh, look at that.
Just share the mic.
So one of the things you've been saying collectively, and I compulsively like to figure out what it adds up to, but I'm going to say two things. One, I think you've said and shown that leadership matters. There's a lot we can know from teachers, from scholars, from people with great talent. But without leaders and institutions who are committed to making sure that 100 years from now, when the world is peopled with all new people, that something happens. So that requires effort and intention. There's a moment in Hamlet where in the bedroom scene, Hamlet gives his mother instructions about, absolutely don't do the following. And then he gives a list. Kind of a funny exercise, but if you're looking ahead 50 to 100 years and you're thinking about advice that you would give to leaders as artists, as institutional leaders, as deans, heads of humanities centers, what is on your list for absolutely don't do this? Or if you do this, you're going to blow it.
It's very hard to know, isn't it, this far in advance. But it feels to me as though one of the things is the scale of the theatres we build. I remember when the theatre in Hampstead opened, it was a 350-seat theatre, and I remember Ed Hall, Peter Hall's son, who was running it, saying, nobody should ever build a 350-seat theatre because there is no way of making it financially viable for anything other than two-handers, And so maybe what are the buildings we're doing it in, and why are they there? The Barbican, which we still perform in, we're doing a very successful show there at the moment. Was designed in the 1970s, so it opened in the 1980s. And it was the pièce de résistance. It was the right, it thought to be the right sort of space. It has lovely, big, wide, comfy seats, plenty of room to get past, and no way at all of getting an audience to get on the front edge of their seat because they're very happy sitting back in the comfort of their own worlds. I think the theatre we've only just recently opened in Stratford, which is a more Shakespearean space in which you are part of the action, is, as an audience, you paper the walls of that theatre, and therefore you can't be ignored, and you are interacted with. That to me is vital. And if I may for a moment, when I as an assistant director really learned what Shakespeare theatre actually meant and what it meant in terms of its relationship to his audience, was when so this was a production of Romeo and Juliet, and Mark Rylance was playing Romeo, which tells you how long ago it was. And Terry Hands, my predecessor as artistic director, was rehearsing the scene where Juliet takes the potion the friar has given her and wonders whether it's poison or not. And so there was the actress, and she was muttering to herself and going, "What if this be a poison the friar subtly has ministered to have me dead?" And Terry said, "Who are you talking to?" And she said, "Myself." And he said, pointing around the Swan Theatre, actually the smaller of the two spaces, "Who are all these people?" And she said, "The audience." And he said, "No, they're your sounding board, They're your friends. They're your confidants. Talk to them. And I was sitting in the audience watching this. And she suddenly went, what if this be a poison that the friar subtly hath ministered to have me dead? And I went, I don't know. Because suddenly, I wasn't watching this young girl have a dilemma, and I could engage or not. Suddenly I was being asked, what would I do if I were her? And that, it awakened me to how Shakespeare's writing those plays because of the audience that he was performing to and the structure of the stage he was performing in. So, I don't know whether...
Don't ignore the audience.
Yeah, don't ignore the audience. The two-way traffic of the stage, there's 2 hours traffic of the stage is a two-way traffic. It's not between the actors doing that, it's between you and how they perform.
I don't know what not to do, but I do feel like I know that coming out of the closures of the pandemic, that the thing that became the most important to me was that we have to, if we're going to have these institutions and spaces, we have to center the people that do the work in them. That the artist is really at the center. It's the driver. The artists are the drivers. Yeah. They're the reason why we're there. And that, for me, what that means is if you have to be anybody who runs a theater right now has to be really intentional about who you bring, why you bring them, what you're engaging with them on, and the way that what their practice is. Because if the space isn't to nurture the practice of the artist, and it becomes more and more harmful, it will become less likely that people will move towards this work professionally or even amateurly. I've shown up at theaters, all over the country, and knew right away that nobody there really understood that I was there, that it was me, actually myself, my own personage, and my artistic self was actually there, and there was very little intentionality about me and what I needed and how I needed this to go and what I wanted. I was generalized in a lot of ways. And specifically, especially if I was working on a play that was about the experience of people who look like me, that there was a kind of like, well, we're doing this for you, and here's a little platform, and maybe it's impactful. We're not going to market it. We don't care. We're not going to actually raise any money here. It's not really for everybody at our theater. It's just for like a couple of people like you. And if your people don't show up, then we also know that we should stop doing that. And there's it's distressing to feel like you walk in a space and and you're bringing all of that stuff that comes with your artistry, and people could care less, right? And then the audience could also care less because they're given the tools to just judge whether or not they like it or they don't like it, but not whether or not they actually engage. So I think a level of intentionality in centering the people who do the work and the way that we rely on artists, that's what the pandemic taught us.
Yeah.
We rely on these artists. Yeah. Oh my God, we need people to interpret our humanity. We need it all the time. We need it more now than we might have needed it 10 years ago, but if we had done it 10 years ago when we really needed it, we wouldn't be so desperate for it right now. So centering the artists, centering the people who do the work.
You have Adele?
Yeah. Don't succumb to the lure of historical amnesia. It benefits people all the time to have that historical amnesia, but it's really, really dangerous and stops creativity. So, for example, I wanted to, Jill Gage, who showed us all those wonderful images yesterday, and she showed us the playbill that the 12-year-old wrote, where it was, what was it, Hamlet, Macbeth, and something else, and she said it was going to be a long night. No, it wouldn't have been, because in the 19th century, they did snippets of, we've forgotten that. So actually, in class, if you only learn a soliloquy, yeah, why not do a night of soliloquies? And juggling, and you know what I mean? I think
and bear wrestling.
We've forgotten a lot of things that we've done with Shakespeare, and if we can try and fight that historical amnesia, we will free ourselves to create something more inclusive, more beautiful, more entertaining, and more inviting to a wider audience.
Thank you for 3 very clear answers. I think it says something about just the dialogue that's happening here. And I know others want to participate. So if you're in the audience and you'd like to ask a question, there is a microphone, and that's important for the fact that we're taping this. But I see 2 questions here.
Yep. Peter's coming with the mic, so please wait. Oh, it might not be on. Is it on?
Hello? No.
Yes.
I remember 60 years ago, when I was in college, having to read King Lear in a Shakespeare class and thinking, I don't know what the hell this play's about. I don't get it. And now I can barely stand to watch it. And we haven't talked about this group. This is the group that I now work with in theater, who are in their 80s and 90s. And they're still an audience. And they're also, I know, some of those grumbling subscribers. But I'm interested if any of you have comments about really wonderful older people in Shakespeare and who those might be, because I'd like to share them with my group and have them do some readings from those people, not just King Lear.
Well, I love your question because as an educator, I feel like human capacity is endless, and we build it through the entire arc of our lives, and that's the job. So I hate that you started with Lear because it's so painful and the wisdom is so hard-won. I mean, every inch of it is hard-won. But maybe you have some thoughts about, I don't know, bouncing points within the
I love when I put a cast together to really make sure there is a real spectrum of ages. The wonderful Oliver Ford Davis, who was to me, definitive Polonius, is now in his 80s and still going strong, as indeed is Patrick Stewart. And somehow having those, we recently did the Henry VI plays, and Paola Dionisotti, who has been a great Isabella, a great Catherine in her time at the RSC. The way that she has just imbibed how to speak this language, how to make it her thoughts, is such an inspiration to the younger people in the company. And there are times when I know younger directors sometimes go, well, I don't want to, they might not want to do, the exercises I want to do, or the way I want to experiment with the play. And they'll often be surprised because some of these older actors have more joy in their process than many of the young actors who are still working out how on earth to survive this profession. And those that have can be a complete joy to work with rather than stuck in their ways as the assumption might be. So I love working with those older actors. I think they inspire.
I think my answer is a little bit different because I just keep thinking, I'm sure there are some amazing and lovely older characters, but I also feel like whatever the point of entry is the point of entry. So anybody who you're working with might actually just be inspired because this is the play that inspires them, and maybe Lear is not the one, right? Maybe and just because the characters in there represent people who are further ahead in age. There might actually be a closer connection to, somebody in the histories or any of the comedies. And so I think it's giving the license to roam free in the worlds and see, in the way that you talked about. There's this time when people would just do soliloquies. Maybe it's just grab a bunch of soliloquies and see how it moves you. And that's why I go back to that teacher who just was like, these are words on a page that represent, that can create an image if you listen to it in a certain way, or if you say it out loud, or if you move it in your body, and it might actually move you. And so here, take this and sort of, drink this and see what happens. And maybe it's a little bit of that as opposed to what are the characters that more closely align with my experience.
Yeah.
I could say right now, if I were to think about it, not a single character in Shakespeare actually closely aligns with my experience. And then there are so many that closely align with so many different experiences I've had. And so both of those are available.
No, I think about James Earl Jones, and he recorded for President Obama, bits from Othello's famous soliloquy that's available on YouTube as well. Like, here's someone in his 80s knocking it out of the park, So, yeah, I think there's lots of examples.
Maybe Gloucester and the Henry Sixes. I think it's like Shakespeare's married couples. There are not a lot of happy ones, but it's an interesting thing that you're talking about. Why Shakespeare? How was he thinking about aging in any way other than Lear?
Well, Falstaff, I guess.
Falstaff,
is the
that's
great.
it, yeah. That's
Falstaff, at the beginning of Henry IV, Part 2, talks to the judge as saying, we that are young, and classing himself as the young, and then by the time the play moves into the fourth act, he says, I am old. Yeah. I am old. And it's the most moving.
The grave digger in Hamlet.
The grave digger in Hamlet,
Clearly.
yeah.
I wonder about Jaques too.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot, actually.
Any ages, yeah.
Now I have you thinking about it.
Please, sir.
Yeah, this is a two-part question, and you've all addressed this generally, but I'd like something more specific. I'm interested in how things are made, so I'd like to know how a director makes a decision, for example, to cast Julius Caesar with a young female, or Prospero with an African-American woman, or Lady Macbeth with a man. When you're making that decision, what are the criteria, the specific criteria that you're considering and weighing to make that decision? And I'm assuming the directors are making that decision just for theatrical novelty, but it's bringing some serious questions to bear. And the second part of the question is, why is that question more often applied, not exclusively, but more often applied to plays by Shakespeare than plays by Chekhov or Strindberg or Miller or Shaw?
I'm just going to put a caveat with your question, is that, are you asking about nonprofit theater or commercial theater?
Yeah.
Because right. So well, I don't know. You guys should answer because you're the directors, but
I really like actors. I mean, I just really love that they can transform. I love that actors have this sort of innate ability to move their own spirit to the side and make space for some other spirit. And so I just really look for the people who can do that. Who can move me. What I like to do is, like, I open a show and I hate opening nights because I hate my work. But I love closing nights because that's their work. And so I really kind of make the decision based on that. And again, because I can do what I want creatively. I can do whatever I want to a play that's 400 years old. I can do whatever I want to some plays that are 10 years old. I can do what I base my want on what my guts are saying, because I trust my guts are connected to something deeper, that are in the roots of the ground, of the soil that we're all walking on. And so I trust that there's some part of me that is connected to you, and the work that I'm doing is speaking to the thing that connects us. And so I look for the actor who can help make that connection deeper and more profound and more impactful. And so I don't I've hired directors who were like, I want an all-male Mackers, for example, and it was a beautiful production because he was interested in engaging in questions about masculinity and like hyper-masculinity and toxic masculinity, and staged all of the interstitial moments on the stage in these progressive movement pieces that the men created themselves based on a few prompts. And so it was deeply moving and glorious. And what the impact was is you discover that maleness is codified just like femaleness. and that men are following a set of rules that may not necessarily be native to how they were born into the world, they're native to how they're raised. And when you remove and you shed some of that and you allow people to just sort of use their bodies to express their connection to emotion, and he needed to do that with a group of men because he was, as an artist, trying to discover something about the world. And so I think it's more about that for me.
It's a very good question, and I think it is, there are as many answers as there are productions, I suspect. Yes. In my experience, it's sometimes, with the Shakespeare, there are actors who, have measured out their lives in Shakespeare parts, though there are less of them now, and are waiting for the moment when they will give their Lear or whatever. And there are some times where you are working with a group of actors and a particular actor springs out. I did a production of Orinoco, which was Afra Ben's novella translated and adapted by B. Bandeli, a British Nigerian writer. And in that production, which was largely a black cast, and therefore that year, for the first time, the entire RSE company was a quarter black, and they had to find parts for those actors, and that was a really interesting exercise. But out of that came one young actor called David Oyelowo, and David, the following year, maybe 2 years later, Michael Boyd, my predecessor, decided that he was the perfect actor to play King Henry VI, because he had a sort of rigorous spirituality, a kind of integrity, and yet a sort of a power in that he wanted for the part. We have had experience at Stratford where a black actor has come on as, for instance, as the King of France in King Lear, and an audience member has stood up and shouted, "The King of France was never black!" And you kind of go,
how do you know?
yeah.
That actor is Clarence Smith.
Yeah. Yes, that certainly was. And the reaction against David was extraordinary. I think certainly at Stratford we've gone way beyond that now, and the choices of specific actors to specific parts. Don't necessarily divide along racial lines at all. I think for most of us would say that there are particular roles and particular parts, and then there are particular actors with particular talents. And you want to see that actor play Rosalind or whatever it is, and it's the right time.
I can say though this, that so in casting Romeo and Juliet, every single production I've ever seen is the black nurse, so I was like, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
Like I've had moments of like real clarity that like no way, there's no way I'm gonna do it. Not a black nurse, not a Latinx nurse, not an AAPI nurse. No global majority nurse. Sorry. Not doing it. So there are moments like that where you have to be really intentional about the impact, because where you are has a different connection to what that image does, what that storyline says, normalizing the servitude of global majority women. And I was like, so there's no way I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
Right?
I had the same experience doing Troilus and Cressida. An actress walked into the rehearsal room to audition, and she was auditioning for Cassandra, which is not a large role, and she was a deaf actor and asked if she could do the role in BSL, British Sign Language. And what came across was this absolutely extraordinary character trying desperately to be understood. Cassandra is blessed with the gift of prophecy, but cursed that nobody will believe her. And the frustration that she poured into trying to get the Trojans to realize that the Greeks were coming was absolutely painful to watch, and was born out of her lifetime experience of being willfully misunderstood and of trying to communicate. And it was, to me, it was a real epiphany moment about what, if you look further than the as it were the usual suspects, what actors and what from different communities can bring to the experience of not just Shakespeare but of any play.
Floor is open for any further questions.
There's one over there.
Is
There's
there-
one over there.
One over here.
Yes.
So, to quote a cliche, obviously, children are the future and your future audience. As a practical matter for people, trying to get young people, usually through schools, to go to plays and musicals and that sort of thing, is there anything, it requires money for schools? Is there anything practical we as an audience can do to either write to our congressman or to our senator to encourage them to fund the arts, all of them?
Yes. Yes, all of that. Encourage the folks on Capitol Hill that arts education is really important. Also do it yourself, model that behavior. Older generations, I think I'm the last class at my high school that had arts education in such an in-depth way where you could major in some sort of artistic practice, right? And that means anybody who's a year younger than me and younger didn't get that, right? And so there is a kind of dissolving of the impact of arts education in a generation, several generations. And so if we want to make sure that young people have a connection to anything that the arts, any kind of artistic practice, any understanding of what how the arts can impact and evolve and change your life, we have to make sure that we put our tax dollars towards it, that we elect the people who are interested in making sure that happens, and then we also have to go to those theaters and say, I'm going to put my resource down here to make sure that there's access here. And $5 is resource, the same as $5 million. So if you want that to happen, you actually have to engage as if you have the ability to make that happen. And you have to center that and make it important. I think the other thing is, so my grandmother took me to performing arts all the time. So there's this idea that when people like me start to talk about leading young people and wanting young people in the theater, that what I'm doing is saying that people who are older than me aren't welcomed. And actually, I think that what I'm saying, I'm not going to say I think that. What I'm actually saying is, I'm interested in the space that I experience, which is rooms full of all kinds of people. Right, where you're rubbing elbows with people you've never met, and they look different from you, and they're older than you, or younger than you, or they brought their kid, and I've been in theaters that are culturally specific, in which engagement is from the youngest child to the oldest adult, and everybody shows up at the theaters together. Those are not historically white theater spaces, the Latinx theater, Black theater. Like I've had that experience in other spaces. And so if we want the PWI theaters to engage, we have to model the behavior, we have to model that experience for generations of people to come by creating spaces in which everybody can be there. Yeah. And by making sure that we invest in the future. Some of the conversations I'm having right now with people who are asking about how to give to the theater, which right now, just go buy a ticket. It'll help, just go buy a ticket. But a lot of the people are asking that, and my answer is like, so go get somebody and get them into the theater with you, somebody who's connected to you. Bring them with you the next time you go, and help them engage. What you don't want to do is, in that engagement, tell them that the way that they would behave without you telling them what to do is wrong. Let them engage in the way that you let them engage at your dinner table, and the way that you let them engage in your living room, the way that you let them engage, when you're walking in the park with them. Like, the theater is a space to engage.
I would just add that we have an amazing learning department at Stratford, and we've had it for a very long time now, and it's built up relationships. But it's also, importantly, built up the data, which says having an engagement with a theatre company like the Royal Shakespeare Company or any arts organisation actually not just increases that kid's desire to go to theatre in the future, it increases their understanding of themselves, of their own identity, of their sense of articulacy, of their senses of oracy, and it allows them to, and therefore, when they've engaged with a company like the RSC, the results across the board in terms of their their perception of maths, of sciences, of everything, changes. And the importance is that that is not anecdotal information, that is now in the data. And I think that's important to gather that so you can make the argument for the importance of direct connection with the arts, of communication, and making that a really genuine, viable thing.
I will add the humanities to that. We need people who have had a substantial connection to someone in their lives. It could be a teacher, it could be a boss, it could be a godparent who has deep experience in the arts or the humanities. And if you decide that you can stretch that link to, well, 1 degree of separation, maybe 2, at about 2, you lose your leadership abilities for an entire culture. And I would argue that we're there right now. But you must invest, and Nataki, I know you've testified before the Congress and made efforts this way. It is a direct relationship between funding, political will, and knowing what you want to do.
And knowing that there are people who are in those positions of leadership that also want to do it, and they do need you to say that it's important to you, for them to be able to step up and announce it, pronounce that into the spaces in which people make laws and rules and decisions about how we live our lives. They do need you to say that it's important to you.
Exactly.
It's not just that they imagine that it's important to you. And I think that's also part of what makes, what separates us, is like the arts become this sort of lofty thing that you get because you have access to resource. And the more we become like that, the less and less we are going to have the ability to communicate and be humane with each other.
Yeah. We have room for one more question. You've already gone, but
Did you raise your hand?
Yes. Okay.
Hold on, it's coming.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to, I really love this conversation that you were just having about the future and youth. And I wondered, just putting a little bit of pressure on the theater and the space itself. We've talked a lot about access and we've talked a lot about representation. But I wonder, I was just chatting with my good friend, like this semester I was teaching a bit about like teatro campesino and like things like that. And it just always, I don't have the history of performance, history with Shakespeare knowledge as so many of you, but, I wonder about the spaces that we've created as well. And like right now I wanted to take my students as we were, looking at Luis Valdez and things like this. I'm like, well, where can I take them? What can we do? But it was always about me taking them rather than something coming to us. We went out to the quad, and I was like, it would have been fantastic if somebody was performing while we were having a discussion session out on the quad, So I wonder about kind of like that reverse way, thinking a little bit more of, maybe what have your experiences been with that? Is it really challenging in terms of just, like even during the pandemic, teachers wanted to be in their classroom because we could have our technology, but you could teach outside as well, right? So is it that we end up in more formal spaces because of just logistical things? Or is it just that...
Capitalism.
Oh, okay, there you go. Thank you.
I mean, that's true, though. It is. So OSF used to have these programs where we'd go out to schools and we'd have there are two threads to pull. There are generations of school children for whom that is the reason why they had an artistic experience. Like that was their connection to it. And then there are also within that same pool groups of people who feel like they were irrevocably harmed in those experiences. And so, again, because I think that you have to be really intentional when you're doing any kind of community engagement, focusing on what is the intersection between the two parties engaging, as opposed to here is this thing that I have for you, and if you don't consume it, it means that there's something wrong with you, which is how often community engagement has been. I think that there's been a lot of push to change that way of engaging. There's also this. So there are theater companies, like Hero Theater Company is a local company, and they actually do all kinds of programs in schools. And so sometimes we're looking to the sort of ginormous, super funded theaters on the hill, when actually it is the culturally specific and the community connected theaters that are really doing that work and should carry that work and also should have the resources to carry that work. And I think that's where the capitalism comes in, because those theaters continue to be under-resourced. So that theaters like mine can be like, oh, we have these lofty programs that connect to community, when actually what we sometimes do is, in the process of connecting, we forget that our hand is a big, scary claw, and we are actually engaging in harm as we are clasping down. And so I think it's really about seeking who are the theaters that are engaging in community, and can they come to you? And then going back to, our lawmakers and saying, we really need funding to make sure that this connection can happen. Yeah. Or going to the big theaters and saying, you got all this resource, you have all that extra cash lying around in your education program, why don't you give it to this theater so that they can come to my school?
Yeah. It is 12:02, and I'm mindful that this is a schedule that we've got to keep to. Let me first thank everyone who's on this panel. It's an incredible gathering that this event has been, and I thank you, Ayanna, for knowing that artists, scholars, people passionate about these plays, and a lot else can productively engage with each other. That's what the past 2 hours have felt like. Thank you so much to those of you on the panel.